Hello. It's been a little while. This is Bridie Rose Smith, live from the Forbidden Library. And I am back from my holiday. I got a lot of sun. And it is still very bright. So I'm gonna keep the sunglasses on. Cause, yeah. We got a whole 2 weeks. Really? Yeah. 2 weeks. Last time I streamed was the 7th. That's so long ago. But I'm back. I had a week in the sun. Today I'll tell you about tomorrow. Because I'll have a whole stream. And I'll tell you all about it then. Rant my adventures then. Because today, as all Sundays are about books. Books. And before we start on today's book, we have slightly more important things. Not important, more important. That's wrong. Not important things. Where's that's the one. Need to hide this. Cause I was gone for like 2 whole weeks. So you know what I did? I finished 2 books since I last streamed. The first one being the second Nier Automata light novel, which I actually finished the day after my last stream, and I was so mad because I wanted to finish it before the end of my last stream so that I could tell you about it before I went on holiday. But hey ho, 'tis life. And yeah, I got it finished. It was very entertaining to read during the anime was airing. Because, oh, hello, Luke Raptor. Well, how are you? Yes, so it's very interesting to read this while the anime was airing because there were details about like A2's backstory in this book and in the anime that differed a little bit. So it's very, very, very interesting. But this book does not follow the game. It has backstory of characters. It has side stories, details about things. It's very good. If you liked Nier Automata and you just wanted more of any of these 3 characters and more of the other characters, I highly suggest it. And I'm good. My break was great. I got a little sunburnt, but we're fine. So that's the first book I read, so I can take my thing down. Oh, I don't want to get big. Yeah. I'm a little crispy. I stayed in the shade as much as I could, but it wasn't enough. Oh, I won't be able to read in these, but I don't need to read just yet. It's fine. Where's my books and tales? There we go. So we're on 80 with Nier Automata there. But because I was gone for so long, I read a second book while I was on holiday. I mean, I bought like 1, 6, 7... I bought like 9 books with me on holiday, and why my glasses doing this? But the only one I actually managed... Okay, my sunglasses aren't working anymore. Bye, guys. I'll put my normal glasses back on. But anyway, I bought like 9 books on holiday with me, but I only actually read 1, unfortunately. I'm about halfway through the other. But anyway, yeah, we're talking about the one I actually completed, which was Magical Raising Project Volume 15, which is the second part of the breakdown story they were doing, which, as I said with the last one, is technically not mainline Magical Girl Raising Project. It is a side web novel sort of thing that the author did. That was the result of a sort of competition. A lot of people sent in their own magical girls, and they got incorporated into this story, which is really cool. But it's not the mainline. However, if you do like Magical Girl Raising Project and have enjoyed it up to book 15, this one still won't disappoint. Because it has cool fights, has cool uses of magic, lots of death, as you would expect. So it is a satisfying Magical Girl Raising Project book, but it is still not what I want. Yen Press! Get on that main story. I'm going to have to go back and read book 13 again. Because I'm going to forget what I need to do. What I need to remember for like when book 16 eventually comes out. Although you don't have a date for that yet. Yen Press, come on. Give me my books. Give me my books. But yes, those are the 2 books that I read during my holiday time. And that brings me down to 9,979. Da-da-da! That's 21 books since I landed here. Now we can get on with the main event of today. Now we have those things out of the way. Let's get my book back up. And I'll give you a bit of a blurb. I should have the blurb up. I should be prepared for things, but why would I do that? That's like something professionals do. So the book we're reading today is it's a bit spooky. It's a little horror-y, but not quite too horror-y. The categories it's in Amazon is dystopian science fiction and action thriller fiction and dystopian. So obviously it's very dystopian. It is called Misperception by Peter McKenna, and here is the blurb before we kick off. After all, what is reality but one's perception of it? Believed to be the last of his kind, Felix has been held prisoner for as long as he can remember, kept under the watchful eyes of the alien captors known only to him as the Tormentors. When a terrifying experience at a nightmarish place changes his perception of everything he's known, Felix realizes that escape is not only imperative, not only imperative, but his only means of survival. Doors that had once seemed closed forever are thrown open, unraveling mysteries of a forgotten past, though thought only to exist in fragmented dreams. In a post-apocalyptic dystopia. This is me practicing my reading already with the blurb. Where dangers lurk around every corner, the adventure of a lifetime awaits. But things are never as they seem. So that's what we're reading. It's going to be exciting. I have permission to read the whole book again, so that's wonderful. I can get through the whole thing. Although I am going to start running out of books soon. I've only got one more lined up after this. And then I need to start hunting for authors to give me their books, but that's fine. We will do that. That is future me's problem. Current me's problem is the fact that my currently reading does not say chapter 1. Where is that? There are so many. Chapter 1. No, not 2. 1. Yeah. Right, let's get on with it. Get this show on the road. This is Misperception, Chapter 1. Solitary Confinement. They'll be here soon. The words came like a fading whisper in the last fleeting moments of sleep, in the space between dreams and reality. At dawn, Felix's iridescent blue eyes shot open as the fragmented pieces of the dream shattered before him. The words had been spoken by the disembodied voice of a mysterious woman, just as they always were in that recurring dream that all too often was there to greet his slumber, but always slipped away just before he woke. Disorientated at first, it took him a moment to adjust to his familiar surroundings. When he finally did so, he yawned, stretched himself out, and then ruffled his white hair. Even though he was still young, his hair had always been white, persistently so. Felix had a restful sleep the night before. Felix hadn't had a restful sleep the night before, not by any means. In fact, his lower back was throbbing this morning, after having spent the night before just like he'd spent many nights prior, sleeping on the hard ground of a cell where he was kept locked up like some sort of caged animal. For as long as he could remember, Felix had been a prisoner. The sun had not yet risen as he glanced out into the dark prison hall. Only the outline of towering shapes that loomed overhead could be seen in this strange, larger-than-life world that he found himself in. The darkness seemed to amplify the shapes and made them appear more threatening than they actually were, casting horribly disfigured shadows along the wall. However, Felix wasn't afraid of them. He'd actually become quite accustomed to them. In truth, there was only one thing in the prison that he needed to be afraid of, something far realer and far more sinister than any shadows could hope to be. Strangely, the voice of the woman that spoke to him in his dreams even seemed to warn of their impending arrival. They would be here very soon. Rising from the ground, Felix felt his way over to the cold metal bars that lined his cell. When he peered out, he could see the large prison window down the dark hallway beside the prison's ever larger front door. Beyond the window, he could see the twinkling stars in the night sky. He followed the various constellations as they twinkled in his vivid blue eyes, and he traced them in his mind, just as he had done countless times before. From his vantage point, there was one star in particular that always caught his attention. It was the brightest one amongst all the others. It was like a beacon of hope in his otherwise dreary reality. In his reality, Felix was a helpless prisoner. There was no denying that. But in his mind, he often imagined himself being beyond the walls of his confinement. He knew what existed out there because, one occasion, he'd been able to gaze upon it through the large prison window. What existed out there was a vast world that he felt distant from, but had always longed for. It was freedom. His thoughts were soon interrupted by the faint sounds of rumbling coming from upstairs. Just as the sun was beginning to peek over the horizon. Of course, he knew what was producing those sounds. They were coming for him. Shifting his glance away from the window, he stared down at the ground of the cell in front of him, where deep scratch marks streaked across the floor. Felix ran a hand along the pattern, and his fingernails seemed to fit perfectly in the marks. Only, the marks weren't his. Throughout his time in captivity, he'd surmised that they must have been left behind by the last prisoner who had inhabited this very cell. Felix shuddered at the thought of what had become of that poor unfortunate soul as the rumbling upstairs gradually grew louder and louder. What followed was the pounding of giant footsteps on the ceiling above. They were almost here. Light from the rising sun slowly began to trickle into the prison hall and absorbed the stars in the sky. Felix glanced around again at his familiar surroundings and could now see the inanimate objects that formed the twisted shadows on the wall from the nights before. The objects were far less intimidating in the daytime, but there was something new that caught his attention above everything else. It was not unfamiliar. Felix had seen its easily recognizable form before, but its presence there down the hallway across from him was new. It was another cell. Somehow his captors must have managed to construct an entirely new cell down the hall from him, seemingly overnight without him noticing. Naturally, Felix wondered, why would there be a second cell if he was the only prisoner? Why would he ever need 2 cells? He stared into its depths, but the contents within its walls were completely shrouded in darkness, so he couldn't make out anything inside. However, there could only be one logical explanation for it to exist here at all. It must have been for another prisoner, a second captive. Hello? Felix called over to it. There was no response. Hello? He tried once more. Still nothing. Felix frowned. If there was something in there already, if there wasn't something in there already, there probably would be soon. The realization both thrilled and terrified him. If there was a second captive, that could mean Felix would finally have a friend in here, and that he wouldn't be alone anymore. However, Felix had never seen another of his kind, let alone met one. And he often suspected that some cataclysmic, apocalyptic event, like an alien takeover, had wiped them all out, and that he was the last of them. That would explain a lot, he thought. But that's when a chilling thought crept in. What if the second captive wasn't a friend at all? What if it was the exact opposite, in fact? This thinking set Felix on edge. There was, of course, a third possibility that frightened him as well. It was that this second captive could be a friend, but that they wouldn't like him. Felix himself had survived this supposed alien takeover, so why couldn't another? But even so, imagine meeting the only other survivor of your kind and they disliked you. To Felix, that possibility was almost worse than any other. Regardless, the very existence of this newly built cell suggested that there was a possibility that he wasn't alone in this world, and gave him the slightest glimmer of hope. Hope was all he could have in the desolate confines of the prison walls. His thoughts were interrupted once again by the sound of giant footsteps stomping around above him and shaking the ceiling. A moment later, the footsteps moved to the staircase at the opposite end of the prison hall. His time was up. They were here. Chapter 2. Dramatic stuff. No! Why am I very good at trying to skip chapters? Take a quick drink. Stay hydrated. Poor old Felix. But is he a survivor of a taken over race? Or is that just his perception? Did that actually come through? I don't think it did. Oh well, we'll have to do without the effects. I did the vine boom, the boom kind of thing. You have to pretend. I could try just removing the monotony. Sound effects are fun. Application capture. Sound effects. Green deck. No, I don't know. It's not working. Oh well. Chapter 2 it is. Figure out some other time. They first appeared on the floor of the prison hall as long shadows twisted into mortifying configurations. However, unlike the inanimate objects of the prison hall, The beings behind the shadows were an even more horrifying sight than the shadows themselves. The creatures stomped down on each individual stair, sending a quake through the floor beneath Felix as he swallowed a heavy gulp. Still, the lump in his throat wouldn't go away. Boop, 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 boop. Then they had reached the bottom of the staircase. Felix could see them in the flesh, in all their terrifying glory. The Tormentors. That was his name for them because, well, quite simply, tormenting him was one of their favourite pastimes. There were 3 of them in all, of varying sizes, but even the smallest still towered over him. I've had a bit of a sniffle when I came back from my holiday. I'm a lot better than I was, and I'm really glad I'm well enough to stream, but I'm still a little sniffly. I'm just gonna mute a moment and make some gross noises. Gross noises over. Not allergies. I think I just caught something on the plane. There was a few people coughing and spluttering and stuff, and I just think I just caught something. But it's just snuffles. That's all. It was a bad cough at one point, but now it's just I'm good. I'm 95% recovered from whatever it was. Okay. Gross noises done. The smallest tower was open. He'd always thought that they must have been some sort of alien race. He believed for his supposed alien takeover theory. Oh, maybe not. Maybe they're not done. I'm sorry. And he often wondered where they had come from, hoping that one day they would eventually go back there and leave him behind. Wherever they had arrived here from, there was one thing Felix thought was for sure. They must have arrived with a fiery crash landing, because the creatures he had come to know as his captors were hideously disfigured. Their appearance was a stark contrast to his own. The Tormentors were horrifyingly deformed. Huge, ugly-looking foul beasts. They had long necks, gangly limbs, nearly hairless bodies, and pale, clammy skin. The smallest was the first to arrive at the foot of the staircase and slowly craned its neck towards Felix, with a deviously mangled grin spread across its face. If that monstrosity at the front of its head could even be called a face. Sorry, apparently the coughing hasn't gone either. Oh no, oh no. Illness. It's fine, we have books. Could be zombies, we don't know. They definitely sound humanish, don't they? Shrinking to the back of his cell, Felix foolishly hoped that it wouldn't come for him. But he knew that it would. It always did. The other 2 tormentors arrived at the base of the staircase next, as the smallest ran over to him with its long, gangly legs, flailing wildly behind it. Felix was pressed against the back of the cell wall as far as he could go. The beast reached down for the latch at the face of his cell and locked the door in place. That locked the door in place. They unlocked it, not unlocked it. And undid it with its enormous hands with terrifying ease. It was strong, much stronger than Felix. The foul creature swung the cell door open violently, then thrust those same enormous hands through the doorway and towards Felix. Helplessly cornered, he sealed his eyes tight shut as he felt the grotesque, spindly fingers of those clammy hands in a death grip around his neck. The smallest tormentor then began dragging him along the ground. Although it was the smallest, this was by far the vilest of the tormentors. It seemed to relish in tormenting him. Felix tried to shout, but all that came out was a feeble attempt at a scream. Finally, the beast pulled him from the cell and lifted him high in the air. Felix began to think, with increasing terror, that whatever it wanted to do to him, it could. Still squeezing, his eyes tightly closed, he could feel the tormentor begin tossing him around, like he was nothing more than the creature's plaything. The smallest tormentor cackled maniacally beneath him. After what seemed like an eternity, one of the other tormentors called out something in their alien language that Felix couldn't comprehend, and the beast that had him finally released him from its grip, sending him in a free fall to the ground. Opening his eyes just in time to see the floor fast approaching, Felix twisted his body and came crashing down on his feet at the last second. We could try a maniacal cackle for the effect. That's more like a witch's cackle. I don't know. That's what it's like. That's the maniacal cackle you're getting. The sweet release of death had eluded him once again. He scrambled away from the beast and found a place to hide in the corner of the prison hall. The beast that had been tormenting him was glaring at the largest of the tormentors, who Felix had assumed to be their leader from the way they all seemed to respond to its calls. The smallest turned away from the largest tormentor and grabbed at the spot where it had dropped Felix. Only he was long gone, and his expression settled on its hideous face. The closest thing Felix could compare it to would be a frown, although he wasn't convinced that these creatures could actually feel real emotions at all. The smallest tormentor rejoined the others around a large table in the mess hall, where they were piling whatever was being served in the prison today onto 3 round plates in front of them. The way that they ate was disgusting. Felix couldn't look away. They shoveled the food into their gullets gluttonously and chewed with their mouths open, sending food particle debris flying over the room. Oi! Don't you start. My blushing doesn't look good when I'm tanned. Tanned, she says. Burnt, but tanned. Okay. Then you start. Then you start with these compliments. Felix felt his stomach rumble from hunger, and he rubbed it. Although watching them eat was disgusting, their food looked good. It always looked good, and the smell was intoxicating. It was usually some tender, juicy cuts of some sizzling mystery meat that was slabbed on top of each other, lining the plate. They always served the best food for themselves, even if they inevitably ended up throwing out a good portion of it. Meanwhile, Felix was left with the same prison slop every day, what he unimaginatively called the brown mush. He tried to imagine the taste of their food on his tongue, instead of picturing the gelatinous brown sludge. they always saved for him. But even though they would usually end up throwing most of their food out, apparently it was better than sharing it. All Felix could imagine tasting now was the brown mush, which he wouldn't describe as good, and he probably wouldn't even hesitate to describe as food. But he was so hungry that he would just about eat anything at this point. Still, he knew that he would have to wait. They always made him wait. Yet Felix sometimes found himself wondering why the tormentors even bothered to feed him in the first place. If he was just around for them to torment, surely there must have been more to it than that. What were they keeping him alive for? When they had finished eating, Felix waited in his hiding place for the inevitable moment when they were going to slop a pile of brown mush onto his plate and toss it onto the floor. Like they always did, as if they hadn't taken enough of his dignity away already. The only problem was, today it never came. Instead, the largest tormentor turned to face the prison hall, empty-handed, and scanned the floor with its beady eyes. He was looking for Felix. He tucked himself back into his hiding space as far as he could go, but so that he was still able to peek out at the beast. It began calling out a deep, demonic voice, the one word that Felix could actually understand when any of them spoke. His name. Felix, it began. A horrifying grin sped across his face. Felix. Laughing demonically, like it was enjoying this little game of cat and mouse, its eyes swept the prison hall. After a few moments of it not being able to locate him, the smile began to fade from the beast's face. It was growing frustrated from the search, and it turned and grumbled something that Felix couldn't understand to one of the other tormentors before turning back again. Its eyes swept the prison hall once more until they suddenly met Felix's, and his heart sank. The twisted smile returned to the creature's face and spread wider and wider, revealing its massive teeth. The beasts were even uglier when they smiled. "What do you want from me?" Felix cried. Backing further into his hiding space, he quickly found himself out of the room. The tormentor didn't answer Felix's cries. Instead, it bent down and reached its massive, clammy hands towards him. Felix sealed his eyes shut, closed as his body began to convulse in fear. The warmth of the beast's hands circled him and then embraced him, cupping him from below. It wasn't as tight as the smallest tormentor's grip, but equally as horrible. The largest tormentor was always the gentlest, but by comparison that wasn't saying much. Felix felt its clammy skin against his body, and a cold shiver ran up his spine. Without a word, the beast plucked Felix from his hiding space and stood up with him in its grasp, with both of its massive hands. Felix kept his eyes shut as the beast grumbled something that he couldn't understand. He knew that it was talking to him, however, because he could feel its hot, repulsive breath on his face, mere inches from his own. Then Felix felt its hand start to shift beneath him. One hand still below him, holding him up, but the other came around to the back of his neck, where it clamped down tighter. The beast then removed the hand underneath him, so that Felix was left dangling by the neck, free floating in the air. Finally, Felix felt a rush of air from below, and knew that the tormentor was bringing him back towards the ground. He thought that meant that his daily torment was coming to an end. However, when Felix peeked out through one eye, he saw that this was only the beginning. Directly in front of him, the tormentor was undoing the latch on the front of the cell door of the new cell that Felix had only noticed this morning, in the opposite corner of the prison hall. Felix didn't know what this could mean, but he knew that it couldn't be good. He began to squirm for dear life, but the tormentor's grip became tighter around the back of his neck. When it finally undid the latch, the cell door swung open violently and banged with a loud clang against the other side of the cell. Felix stopped squirming for a moment and peered in. The interior of the cell was shrouded in darkness, and he could only imagine what horrors awaited him inside. His overactive imagination began to conjure up images of monsters that were far worse than anything he'd experienced, and somehow even uglier than the tormentors. Felix believed that he now had an answer for the question that often lingered in his mind. Why did they even bother to feed him in the first place? What were they keeping him alive for? The answer was this. Whatever this was. Maybe today, Felix was breakfast for whatever was hiding inside of this new cell. The tormentor's hand started to move Felix towards the opening at the front of the cell. No! Felix cried and began squirming again, stretching out all of his limbs, contorting his body into a tangled mess of arms and legs. He kicked at the opening of the cell door, barely managing to miraculously pin himself against its borders. This angered the beast, and it roared out in frustration, pulling Felix back and attempting to thrust him in once more. Felix kicked his arms and legs out again, as far as they would stretch, pinning himself against the border of the cell door once more, but his head and torso were pressed inside. He held himself there with all his might, but he could feel his grip beginning to slip. The tormentor roared again and pulled Felix back more forcefully. Its hand moved him down towards the cell aggressively for the final time. Before Felix had another moment to object, he was tossed inside the cell and into the mouth of whatever was waiting for him inside. Now, I don't know about you, but when I was reading this as a preview, just to sort of vet it for streaming, as I do, I started to figure out what the misperception here was. And my guess is that Felix is some kind of cat or bunny rabbit. A very anxious cat or bunny rabbit who is about to go to the vet. That is what I think this book actually is. Which is really funny if that is the case, because obviously our last book was Marcus' Misadventures, which had a cat that was it was a cat. It wasn't like super loving, but it wasn't like this. It wasn't like, oh no, my tormentors. So I think it's a really funny comparison to the book we just had to read this afterwards. Also, if that is the case, we are 3 for 3 on animal books this year. But we don't know. We don't know. We'll find out after I update the chapter count. Yeah. We'll see if my guess is correct. Because the only thing that throws me off is a bit of the blurb as well. As much as I think that Felix is some kind of bunny or rabbit, there's this whole unraveling mysteries of a forgotten past thought only to exist in fragmented dreams. That sounds a bit complicated for a cat or a bunny rabbit, so let's continue and find out. Oh no, you gotta go! Well, thank you for turning up anyway. I highly appreciate it. And I hope you have a wonderful day. Yeah, glad you could stop by. Goodbye. Chapter 3. A very very bad a very bad place. Bye. Only there was no mouth waiting for Felix inside. In fact, there was nothing there at all. Tumbling into the cell, Felix smacked his head against the back of the wall, against its back wall. Dazed, he sat there for a moment as he tried to rub the senses back into his head. When he finally recovered, he scurried to the back corner of the cell and cowered there, looking out just as the largest tormentor was securing the latch on the door in place, locking him inside. The beast then lowered its deformed head and peered its beady eyeballs in, grinning directly at Felix. The tormentor stood up and walked out of view for a moment. However, it returned a few moments later and threw a covering over the front of the cell, thrusting Felix into complete darkness. Gravity abruptly shifted, and Felix could tell that he was off the ground once again. He decided that this new cell was no cell at all, but rather some sort of vessel for prisoner transport. The floor beneath him was slick, and he quickly lost his footing as he was swung back and forth like a pendulum. Briefly, Felix thought he had heard the prisoners blah 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 blah. I've gotten like 40 minutes in, and that's the first time I've tripped over my words. I'm proud of myself. Briefly, Felix thought that he heard the prison's large front door creaking open. The warmth of sunlight bled into the cell, and Felix could smell a sweet aroma wafting with the light breeze. He was outside, beyond the prison walls, but far from freedom. A moment later, the prison's large front door slammed closed behind him. All of this swinging was making Felix incredibly dizzy, so he closed his eyes to try fend off the nausea. Another door opened somewhere in front of him, and he was thankfully placed down on solid ground once again. The warmth of sunlight disappeared as he was loaded like cargo into what he could only imagine was the hull of some alien spaceship. Felix wanted to stand up, but decided to stay put. Sprawled out on the floor of his new containment vessel, he didn't know what to expect next. The door closed behind him and took with it the sweet aroma of the outside. Everything was still, but only for a moment. This was just the calm before the storm. Things were about to get much worse. A loud rumbling suddenly shook the ground like an earthquake, preparing the ship for liftoff. The rumbling quickly quieted to a dull roar, but the constant quaking continued. And my nose is being a bit weird, just a second. Gross noises from being slightly sick, yeah! Where are you taking me? Felix cried, rising unsteadily to his feet. Even he was surprised that he was able to conjure up the courage to speak. Nobody answered. Without even a countdown to launch, He was unexpectedly jerked forward as the spacecraft took off. Felix fell back over, smacking face first into the floor. Planting his foot against the wall, he struggled to his feet once more. "Where are you taking me?" He cried for a second time, growing more and more desperate with each passing moment. Still no answer. A few more times he was flung forward and backward as the world around him seemed to jerk around in every direction. Obviously, Felix knew that the tormentors were transporting him somewhere, but he couldn't even begin to fathom where. At one point during the journey, the nausea became too much for Felix, and he crawled shakily to a corner of his containment and gagged. But there was nothing in his stomach to come up. A good while later, just when he thought that it would never end, the quaking finally stopped, and the dull roar quietened entirely as the spacecraft docked at its destination. He lay there in silence for a moment, with his head throbbing, until he heard a distant door opening and closing, the cabin depressurizing. Everything was still again. He tried to look around, but the covering was still draped over the bars that lined the front of his containment, and he couldn't see anything beyond the darkness. Another door opened, this one closer than the last that he heard, and gravity shifted once again as he was unloaded from the ship's cargo. "We're here," Felix thought, with increasing horror and a sense of impending doom. Wherever here was, whatever here was. He felt the warmth of sunlight again, and the familiar sweet aroma of the outside. The door slammed shut behind him, and he was being swung around again. There was a rush of wind, and the warmth and aroma disappeared. It was replaced instead with a distinct smell that this place, whatever it was, offered the stench of primal fear. It was quiet for a moment, but then there was a sound that made Felix feel each individual hair raise goosebumps throughout his body. It was the sound of faint, distant screaming. As they continued to move, the screaming grew louder and louder, like he was moving towards it. "What is this place?" Felix pleaded. Even though it was dark, he closed his eyes tightly and reached his hand up to his ears to try block out the screams, and pretended he was anywhere else. There was no answer to his plea again. In any event, he knew that this surely wasn't the prison hall anymore. The screaming gradually quietened, muffled almost as they continued, but it was still there, in the distance somewhere. When the swinging finally stopped, Felix was placed down on solid ground once again. A heavy sigh engulfed him, the sound of his own breathing and thumping heart almost deafening in the quiet. Gradually raising unsteadily to his feet, he felt his way to the back of his containment. The covering in front of his cell was abruptly removed, and the prisoner transport vessel was flooded with blinding white light. It took Felix's eyes a few seconds to adjust, but soon a looming shadow was cast before him, blocking most of the light. When he looked out towards the bars that lined the containment door, he saw the source of the shadow and the beady eyes of the tormentor that was staring at him again. The beast's crooked smile was taunting him, like it knew the unfortunate fate that Felix was soon about to meet. and like it found great pleasure in his anguish. It was almost like it was relishing in the fact that Felix was soon about to find out the foul creature's dastardly plans for himself. Felix wanted to shout something obscene at it and curse whatever heinously disfigured beast of a mother that creature had undoubtedly crawled its way out of, but he was too terrified to speak. The tormentor lifted its head away and covered him again. Shortly after, Felix could hear its demonic voice. Then there was the voice of another coming from the other side of him. At first, Felix wasn't sure if it was the echoes playing tricks on him, but realized with increasing horror that there were two of them. This new one sounded even more demonic than the familiar one. Were they perhaps bargaining over his fate? When they finally stopped speaking, he was lifted up once again. Doors opened and slammed shut around him as he rocked back and forth. Felix imagined that he was being transported down some sort of long hallway filled with doors, where behind each one was a new horror for him to experience. Unfamiliar voices of other tormentors seemed to surround him in the hallway. There must have been a dozen of them there now. With such a congregation of them, Felix assumed that this place must have been the aliens' mothership. Some tormentors seemed to be conversing with each other, while others seemed to be laughing dementedly. Felix wondered if they were all waiting for their turn to torment him. That was what he figured this place had to be, right? It was some wicked place where the tormentors did what they did best and tormented someone like poor Felix. One of the tormentors briefly lifted up the cover in front of the transport. The vessel's door briefly lifted up the cover of the transport vessel's door with a sickening smile on its horrifying face. It was even uglier than the other tormentors that Felix had become familiar with, the three that watched over him. He was trembling as it covered him back up. The faint, distant screaming became increasingly louder, until finally Felix felt another rush of wind, and the screaming was as loud as ever. When the screams were all around him, for the first time Felix could tell that these weren't just indistinct screams meant to terrify him. No, they were something far more foreboding. They were cries for help. Many cries from many different sources that culminated into the indistinct sound of screaming from a distance. Now they seemed so close that he could hear each individual desperate plea. The most shocking of all was that Felix could actually understand them. He instinctively reached his hands up to his ears again to try block them out, but it was a fruitless effort. Felix was placed down again, and in the midst of the screams, it all felt like some sort of nightmare. But unfortunately, he knew it wasn't. This was reality. The nightmares would come later. The containment door swung open violently, and a pair of massive alien hands reached out to grab him. Felix went to scream himself, but was so surprised that all that came out was a pathetic chirp. Before he even knew what was happening, the creature had him in its clammy grasp. Felix tried to squirm free, but it just squeezed him tighter. The hands yanked him out of his containment, for an instant, Felix could see the white walls of the place around him, and thought that he saw others that looked like him locked in cells across from him. However, When he would later recount the incident, he wasn't sure if he'd imagined that altogether. One thing that he knew for certain was that he definitely wasn't in the prison hall anymore. The wretched beast quickly threw another cover over the top of him, and Felix was thrust into darkness once again. With every ounce of strength in him, he tried to struggle free from its grasp, but it was far stronger than him, and held him down with terrifying ease. It seemed like the harder he struggled, the harder it pushed back, and the tighter its grip became. Still, Felix fought desperately to escape, until he felt another set of hands grab and twist him, contorting him into an unpleasant position. "Ow!" he cried, but his cries were drowned in the sea of desperate pleas for help from the others around him. I wish the author had put in what some of these cries for help were. just to like a little, even if it's just a help, bad things, I don't know. I would really like to know what Felix is hearing specifically. Felix struggled even more fiercely than before. He knew that these creatures meant to either torture him or kill him. "Stop it!" he pleaded. More hands joined the second pair in forcing him to the ground, so that he was helplessly pinned there, completely immobilized. "Please!" Felix cried. "Why are you doing this?" The tormentors pulled and poked at him from every angle in what he could only assume was some sort of twisted experiment. The last thing Felix could clearly remember was a sharp piercing in pain poking into his lower back, and then he began crying, and then began cycling, not crying, he's probably already crying, in and out of consciousness. The rest was a bit fuzzy. One second he was pinned down, the next he was on his back in a prison cell, and another moment he was laying on his back, tied down and hooked up to several strange machines that beeped in time with his slow, steady heartbeat. Even if he wasn't tied down, however, there was no hope of breaking free from the ties, because although he was somewhat aware of what was happening, he couldn't move. It felt like he was dreaming, but that he was awake at the same time, but not in control, like an out-of-body experience. A group of unfamiliar tormentors was standing over him, and there was a bright white spotlight shining down. Felix couldn't actually see what they were doing, but it almost felt like they were probing around inside of him. The thought of which made Felix incredibly lightheaded, to the extent he began to slip away from whatever this place was altogether. Everything around him, including the screens, soon faded to black. So he's a bunny that got surgery. He's a bunny, he's got surgery, so there must have been something wrong with him. Maybe that's why he thinks everyone's out to get him. Or they're just an incredibly terrible family because they let the tiny child handle the bunny all the time and just drop it all the time. No wonder they're scared. That would be awful. Chapter 4, let me just take a small drink. Chapter 4, Waking Nightmare. Another thing about this book, another reason I wanted to read it, is because if I'm right about its concept, and we're already at the vet, how are we only on 9%? What else happens in this book? Because I mean, the concept I think we've got at the moment, if this is like a anxious bunny rabbit, is good, but I just don't know how that's gonna hold up a whole book. Like, to me, that's like a short story or maybe even a novella idea, because I feel like that would be quite short. You'd have them escape. That would be it. I'm genuinely curious what you've done here, Peter, and I look forward to finding out in chapter 4. The next thing that Felix could remember, he was standing in an unfamiliar dreamscape. So, towering buildings made entirely of mirrors loomed overhead, rising like massive monoliths and forming a twisted labyrinth in the space between them. Beyond them, the darkness swirled in the night sky. When Felix looked into one of the mirrors, he was met with his own reflection, and he saw again just how unlike anyone else he'd ever met he was, especially the tormentors. In the distance, he thought he could hear someone calling to him, and he was curiously drawn to the sound of their voice. The closer he drew, the more he realized the voice belonged to the mysterious woman, the one he had dreamt about many times before, but only in fragmented pieces, that often warned, "They'll be here soon." Strangely enough, this time the pieces seemed to fit together to the point where they revealed a clear picture for the first time. As he winded his way through the shadowy maze of mirrors, the unfamiliar surroundings began to become more and more familiar in a dreamlike sort of way. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had been here before, but he chalked it up to the mirrors playing tricks on him. When he finally arrived at the source of the voice, he was finally able to see the figure it belonged to for the first time. Before this, she only came to him as a disembodied voice, but now he finally had a face to match. Felix watched her silently from the shadows. She looked very different from anyone Felix had ever seen before. Much different than the tormentors. Although, she also looked strangely familiar. Not only did she look just like him, which was odd enough considering the fact Felix believed himself to be the last of his kind, but her eyes were the very same shade of blue as his own. Felix could see that she was carrying a small bundle with her, but couldn't quite tell what it was other than the small tuft of white hair, not unlike his own, poking through the top. Subtle. The woman seemed frantic, but never seemed to notice Felix, standing there, watching her. She was speaking in hushed whispers to the delicate bundle that she carried with her. Felix continued watching curiously. The woman soon found a small crevice at the base of one of the towering buildings where the mirror had cracked, and she placed the bundle down there, stowing it away. The bundle began to whimper, and the woman hushed it harshly, and yet comfortingly. "Hush, little one," she said. "They'll be here soon, and they mustn't find you." Felix finally caught a full glimpse of the bundle the woman was carrying, and saw its own vivid blue eyes. He realized very quickly that the tuft of white hair curled up in the bundle was him, but much younger, no older than an infant. This realization validated the striking sense of familiarity he felt when he'd first seen the woman, because he realized that he did in fact know her. It was like the fragmented pieces of dreams that often taunted Felix for nights on end came together all at once. Felix knew instantly who the mysterious woman was. None other than his own mother. Nah, really? His mother pleaded again with little Felix to stop whimpering, and when he finally did, she glanced down both ends of the maze of mirrors she found herself in, and then took off running, abandoning her child there. A grave silence fell heavily over the place. Felix stared at the bundle, left helplessly alone in this cold, dark labyrinth. This was no place to leave a child. Gradually, the little bundle began whimpering again, quietly at first, but it soon built to full-blown hysterics. Little Felix was crying for his mother. Felix's heart sank further and further as he watched the scene unfold. However, little Felix's cries soon ceased abruptly. From the shadows emerged a terrifying figure that made real Felix's heart leap into his throat. It was like some sort of half tormentor, half robot hybrid. What accompanied the vile creature's arrival was the sounds of frenzied screams from somewhere close by. As he stared in horror at the beast before him, the scene melted into blackness right before his very eyes. There in the darkness, Felix could hear his mother's own blood-curdling scream in the distance. Felix awoke moments later, gasping for breath as if he'd had a near-drowning experience. His eyes darted around the room, and he recognized the dark, towering shapes and disfigured shadows on the wall around him. He was back in the prison hall. He was alive, and he was back. Felix breathed a sigh of relief. It was a bad dream. The twisting labyrinth of mirrors, his mother, even the awful place he'd been experimented on, and the screams that had engulfed him. Oh, it must have just been a horrific nightmare, brought on by Felix's overactive imagination. It had to be. But still, something was nagging at him as he tried to suppress, but he couldn't quite let go. Something felt different. The line between imagination and reality is whisper thin. After all, what is reality but one's perception of it? Felix could vividly remember the screams that he'd heard when he first entered into that awful place, the aliens' mothership. It was unlike anything that he'd ever heard before. Then he could remember the aliens' hands that reached for him as they squeezed around him and dragged him from the containment vessel. The memory was so real. The others, like him he'd seen, surely must have been his imagination. After all, he was certain that he was the last of his kind, so they couldn't have been real. He thought about the desperate feeling of helplessness as he was pinned down. Finally, he thought about the sharp piercing into his lower back before everything went fuzzy. He distinctly reached for the same spot, and he cried out. The spot felt warm and painful to the touch, but that wasn't even the worst of it. Slowly, he reached his hand down towards his lower back, middling until he felt the fresh and still tender incisional scar from where they had opened him up, probed around inside of him and stitched him back together. Realization quickly turned to sudden horror. It had been very real. Felix closed his eyes and began to tremble. What did they do to me in there? He whimpered aloud, trying to fight back tears as his lower lip quivered. He felt different. Something about those experiments made him feel different. At first, Felix wondered if they implanted something inside of him, like an embryo or an egg. What that would hatch after a prolonged incubation and split Felix open as a new little bundle of torment entered the world. But that didn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. Especially considering that he didn't feel like something foreign was still inside of him. Rather, it felt like something was missing. Felix convinced himself then that they had taken something out of him. What are they going to do with me next? He groaned. There was only one explanation that he could see. His glance caught the scratch marks on the cell floor left behind by a previous captive, and he instinctively ran his fingernails through the grooves again. As he did so, he thought about the tormentor's always deliciously smelling food, the mystery meat, which normally made his stomach grumble with hunger, but now made it turn over in disgust. Something had happened to the last prisoner, who left behind those scratch marks. That much he was sure of. Now he had a gruesome assumption, fearing that the same would soon happen to him next. Whatever had happened in that forsaken place, the mothership, Felix was now certain that it was preparing him to meet the same fate as the prisoner before him. All this time, tormentors had been feeding him and keeping him alive, and Felix had wondered to what end. The answer to the question was now so painstakingly obvious that he couldn't believe he'd never figured it out sooner. Although maybe he'd suppressed the thought because of how abhorrent the reality of it really was. The tormentors were fattening him up in preparation to be eaten. Perhaps they had harvested his organs for their own consumption in that terrible place, and it was just a matter of time before they decided to indulge on the rest of him. Felix was never just a prisoner. He was dinner. Curled up on the floor of his prison cell, Felix decided then and there that he couldn't stay here any longer. It was time to leave. We are only 11% of the way in. What is the rest of this book? I'm so curious. We are only 11% of the way in. We've done most of the blurb, which honestly, it's a good thing, actually. Because I find that there's some books that like have their... You have your blurb and you know what's going to happen for a bit, but it still takes like a quarter of the book to get there, kind of thing, to get that concept going. But this one hasn't. We've only 11% in the way in. That's been like a total of an hour and 20 minutes of me talking, and I had about 20 minutes talking crap at the start as well. So it's only taken us about an hour to get in, and that's me reading out loud. So if you read in your head, that'll be a lot quicker as well. So that's wonderful, actually. And I'm so curious what the rest of this book is going to be. Is he going to get out? Are we going to have, like, adventures of him going across this quote-unquote dystopian world that may or may not just be our world because he's a small bunny rabbit? Although, the description of, like, putting his hands over his ears and stuff, that does throw me off on my, bunny rabbit theory. There's definitely hallmarks of him being kept as a pet. But, I mean, it is entirely possible that he's a human and there has been an alien invasion and they keep the humans as pets. That's an entirely possible theory too. I really look forward to finding out, I really do. So we could probably get one more chapter in, I reckon, assuming this one isn't too long. They've all been fairly nice chunky chunks. Nice chunky chunk chapters. Chunky chunk chapters. Anyway, I'll stop being silly. Only mine are silly during the Sunday reading. We have reading to do. It's important. And we will start chapter 5. Last meal, not the last meal. Stop adding words to me. Felix never tried to escape from the prison before. He was too afraid of what would happen if he tried and the tormentors caught him. Now it seemed like whatever they could do to him, whatever atrocious punishments they could conduct, couldn't possibly be worse than what had already happened to him in that wretched place, or the fate the tormentors had planned for him next. Escape was not only imperative, but his only means of survival. His back arched as he rose unsteadily to his feet. Every action that he did seemed slower than he intended it. It was like he wasn't fully in control of his own movements. He attributed this to whatever the beasts had done to him in that awful place. Gradually he crept over to the cell door and peered out. The stars beyond the large window shined in a faint light, so that Felix was just barely able to make out the vertical metal bar that latched his cell door in place. Reaching his hand out between two of the bars for the latch, he tried to push it, but it wouldn't budge. Once more he tried again, but it still wouldn't budge. Felix was about half strength right now, and it was waning by the second. Still, he feared that even at full strength, he wouldn't be able to move the bar. Even the smallest tormentor could undo the latch with such ease, but Felix feared he would never be able to. Just thinking about the vile creatures made Felix sick to his stomach. He didn't ever want to see them again. Reaching his hand out once more towards the latch, Felix strained desperately with all his might, but he still couldn't get it to move an inch. Finally, he gave up and sat back on this cold cell floor. "This is hopeless," he whimpered. Felix looked around the darkened cell. All that the tormentors left in there with him was a bowl that they filled with stale water and a small toilet in the corner of the room. He wondered why they even bothered leaving him water tonight, and he thought spitefully that he wasn't going to drink it. Either he was getting out of here tonight, or he was going to die in here. Tears welled up in his eyes. Tomorrow would be here soon, just as it always was. Who knew what else those foul beasts had in store for him before they ultimately decided to eat him? They loved his pain, and they fed off it. At least until they were going to feed off the rest of him. To them, he was just a toy to be played with. Felix laid down and rolled over to his side. Every time he closed his eyes, he went back to that terrible place. On the verge of sleep, the screams would jerk him awake. Sleep was the only thing that would escape him that night. With the dawn came the sound of the tormentors stirring upstairs. Felix's eyes darted around, desperately for a way out of the cell, but he already knew there was none. It was just a matter of time before he saw their horrid figures at the base of the staircase. The thought of whatever torment they had planned for him today filled him with relentless anxiety. His eyes were fixated on the staircase. All he could do was helplessly wait. His heart pounded in his chest. The rumbling from the stairs grew louder until he could hear their voices coming down from the top of the staircase like demons from hell. If upstairs was hell, then he didn't know what made the prison hall downstairs, where he found himself now. One by one they stomped down until the smallest tormentor appeared at the base. It turned slowly towards Felix, with its grotesque, wide lips curled into that same devious grin that it always seemed to wear. Today, it looked even more devious, and Felix couldn't help but feel that today, the beast meant to kill him. He frantically retreated to the back of its cell as the smallest tormentor stomped menacingly over to him. Oh. Oh, sorry, gross noises again. The creature's gangly limbs flailed wildly in every direction. Felix closed his eyes and gulped. He could soon feel himself enveloped in its shadow as he remained there, helplessly tucked away into the back corner of the cell. Shaking, Felix waited with bated breath to feel its clammy hands around him, choking the life from him slowly. However, the hands never came. Instead, he heard the beast cackling, but then the shadow disappeared. Felix peeked a cautious eye open. The other tormentors slowly filled into the prison hall and around the large table in the mess hall, just down from where Felix's cell was. Neither of the others seemed to pay any attention. For a moment, Felix wondered if he was already dead. They gathered around the table with their heaping plates of food and proceeded to shovel it into their mouths. Felix watched the food particles spew out in all directions. He was disgusted, but also starving, having not eaten in almost 2 days. Their food smelled especially good today, and he would have given anything to have their scraps, or even just a morsel. That is, until he remembered what their food actually was. Or who it was, more accurately. That made him wonder what their food's name had been. I guess that's what vegans feel like. If he could, Felix would have loved to climb on top of that table and knock everything off it. If for no other reason than to spite his alien captors and bring them down to his level. The thought of everything chaotically crashing to the floor and smashing brought him just the slightest bit of satisfaction. After watching in agony for a bit, his stomach twisted in all kinds of knots and produced a bevy of monstrous noises. The beasts finally finished eating. The smallest tormentor disappeared for a moment and returned with a plate piled high with the gelatinous sludge that Felix had come to know as his brown mush. A drool subconsciously fell from the corner of his mouth, and Felix licked his lips. The smallest tormentor turned to face him and began moving towards him. Felix's eyes were gluttonously fixed on the plate of brownish mush, jiggling to and fro with every movement that the beast made. Finally, the beast reached his cell and placed the plate of food down beside itself. Then it bent down and undid the latch at the front of the cell with terrifying ease. The smallest tormentor placed the plate of mush down on the cell floor between them. Felix peeked curiously up at the smallest tormentor, who seemed to be staring at him expectantly, almost like it was waiting for him to thank it. For a tense moment, the two stared each other down. Finally, The beast reached his cell and placed the plate down. No, wait. I must have missed the next button. Until the largest tormentor, the leader, barked an order at the smallest. Felix glanced down at the plate of brown mush, which had settled in place. As much as he wanted to, he didn't dare make a move towards it, for fear that this may have been some sort of trap. Maybe as soon as he made a move for the food, the tormentor was going to reach in and grab him. Then, the nightmare would really begin. He glanced back up at the smallest tormentor. Its lips curled into a sinister grin, and it let out a shriek as Felix recoiled in fear. However, instead of reaching for him, the tormentor retreated from the front of the cell, slammed the door shut and locked it before stomping away. Felix glanced down again at the plate of brownish mush in disbelief. This was the first time he could remember that they didn't torment him. Something wasn't right. Staring down at the free meal they had offered, he remembered that they were only giving it to him to fatten him up, to eat him. He shook his head. Since that was the case, then Felix didn't have any other choice. Creeping cautiously over to the plate of food, he started eating it. If he was going to escape, he was going to need all of his strength. The brown mush never tasted so good. Ta-da! It's the fact that we haven't had a description of Felix himself. Other than the fact we know he has 4 limbs, we know nothing else. We know nothing! On his colour scheme, we know he has white hair and blue eyes. But that could be anything. That could mean white fur. He could mean white fur. Or he could just be a person. And they could be aliens, but they treat him like an animal. I don't know! Mysteries. It's only Harvest. No, actually, more Ikai. More Ikai. I changed my mind. We can get another chapter in. We can get another chapter in this. Chapter 6. How many chapters are there? Must be quite a few if we're already on chapter 6. That's about. It's 25 chapters in this bad boy. I reckon we can get another one out of this. Or should I wait? Or should I not? Or should I just wait till next week? Choices. No. I'll be good. We'll save it till next week. I lied. I'm sorry. I got excited. I really want to know. I hope everyone else is as interested in this as I am. Because, like I said, it's a very cool concept. But one, if I'm correct on the concept, will it... How long will it go? 2, am I even correct on the concept? Is Felix right? We know that Felix's perceptions probably aren't right. That's been heavily put in. And we know that the tormentors sound very much like a family. There's 2 adults and a child, and there's the child that is very rough with him, and the adults that kind of know how to handle him a bit better. We also had the whole back of the neck thing, like he was being held by the scruff of the neck. But then there's been descriptions of how Felix kind of does things, and they're very human-like, and I don't know whether the author's just done that because otherwise it's too obvious, or if maybe he is human. And I'm assuming he's a bunny, or a cat, or something. I'm only assuming a bunny and cat because of that bit where he gets dropped. And you know how cats do that sort of contorting in the air to land on their feet? Bunnies do kind of do it too. They're not as good at it, but they do it. So that's why I think he's a bunny or a cat. Also, his name is Felix, so that also says cat to me. So I don't know. I don't know. This is further than I read because I only read a 10% preview. But anyway, I suppose I'm done ranting now. Oh, I'm looking forward to reading more of this. I really am. Really, really am. But that is all from me today. I will be back tomorrow. And tomorrow I will tell you all about my holiday that I had. I will tell you about my trip to a place in the library that may or may not have looked a lot like and had people there that looked a lot like people from Barbados. It was great. And I'll also be playing Cookie Clicker at the time because I kind of just want something in the background. I don't know if I can hold up a whole chat. Just a talky stream on my own. So I feel like I just want something in the background that I can click on and do something in my hands, you know. Then I'll be back Tuesday as well with some Final Fantasy. And then after Final Fantasy, I'm sure my redness will go down and I will be back to normal for more Perception next Sunday. I would also like to let people know that obviously I'm very close to 200 subs now. It's very exciting. And I would like to do a very special short story. I had a few different ideas. So if you would go to my community tab on the YouTubes, I will show you here. I went on holiday. I went to the Bahamas. But I didn't go to Bahamas. I went to Barbados. I went to Barbados and got tanned. / burnt. Anyway, I was gonna show you guys my community tab. Because currently there is a vote. I've got some votes on there. Because I'm going into 200 subs and I would like to do a special short story. And these are the short stories I've been thinking about. So we've got Death Swarm, Resurrection Magic. It's very annoying when people don't want to die. Penscalibur, truly mightier than the sword. 200 mysterious eggs, which honestly I have no idea about. Just 200 mysterious eggs. What more do you need? And the tiny dragon's heinous heist. Miniature dragon wants to steal things. Again, what more do you need? Yeah, get your bots out for whichever one you want. And I will get writing on that at some point. I don't know how long the thing's going to be. I guess that depends on, you know, how fast my subs go up. But I think that's all I've got to tell you about today. Like I said, I will be back tomorrow. I will tell you all about my time in Barbados. And with cookies. And it'll be great. But that is me. If you enjoyed, please leave the likes and please do the subscribe. That would make me very happy. Other than that, I had fun. I hope you had fun. This has been Brandon Smith, live from the Forbidden Library. Goodbye. Oh wait, no, I forgot to do my thank yous. It's been a while. I forgot all my sign-off things. Okay, thank you to Palmstar and Luke in chat. Thank you to anyone who lurked, and thank you to anyone who watches the VOD as well. Yes, okay, now I can say goodbye. Goodbye.